Now I'm going to begin. So, have you all ever heard of big ones before? Does that mean anything to you? Maybe you call them by a different name. I don't know. Some people say that the big ones live in the hills. Some people say that the big ones live in the sky. The truth is the big ones live all over the place. Up, down, in, out, near, far. And the most important thing is just to know how to call them. Anyway, well, this is a story about a time when the big ones were called. And our story begins in a walled city. Walls for as far as you can see that circled all around the city. And within the walls of these cities lived a group of people who knew themselves as time perfecters. They perfected time. What does that mean, perfect time? Well, these people had a king, and of course the king had a big fancy palace, jeweled windows, jeweled doors, the whole thing. Of course his palace was surrounded by a lot of armed guards. And this king said that when he went to sleep at night, the master of time would come to him in his dreams and give him the information that his people needed to perfect time the next day. So in the morning, the king would come out of his big jeweled doors, and he would say, "Good morning, time perfecters. Another beautiful day for us to practice the noble art of perfecting time. And as you all know, each day we spend perfecting time, we lay another stone on the path to a realm where there is no more loss, where there is no more pain, and in fact, where there is no time at all. So today, again, we begin that noble work. Pen and papers at the ready?" And the time perfecters would get out their pen and papers and he would say, "Let's begin. You must do jumping jacks for 5 minutes, 27 seconds, 3 milliseconds. You must twiddle your thumbs for 27 minutes, 53 seconds, 24 milliseconds. You must," and this one will be difficult, "jump on 1 foot for 11 minutes, 52 seconds, 60 milliseconds. And on and on and on. They wrote it down, and that was how the time perfecters spent their day. Now outside, oh wait a second. So how did they time each other? You can't perfect time without a way to keep time, right? So the time perfecters had these very special stopwatches. They were the most accurate stopwatches. They were the most finely made, and this is what the time perfecters used to time themselves. Who made these stopwatches? If you looked beyond the walls of the city, you could see great plumes of smoke rising above. For beyond the walls of the city were huge factories in which these stopwatches were made. And these stopwatches were made by a group of people called the makers. And they worked in the factories long days into the night, and their village was built around these factories. They were the makers, and they lived outside the city. And the people who lived inside the city never saw the makers. The only way they even knew that they existed was because of the great plumes of smoke and the bundles of stopwatches that would be delivered from time to time through the gates of the city. So, within the time perfecters, there were doers and there were timers. Now, the men were generally doers and the women were generally timers. And what about the people who weren't men or women? Well, if you weren't a man or a woman, then you had to pretend to be a man or a woman, and if you didn't do a good enough job pretending, you would be exiled. These time perfecters were foolish. So, there was a family inside the time perfecters. There was a mother, there was a father, and there was a little girl. Her name was Maxine. She was 8 years old. And her brother George, he was 16 years old. And he was training to be a doer just like his father had been a doer, and Maxine was training to be a timer just like her mother was a timer. Now, George was a very good doer, arguably the best in the city. But Maxine was a very bad timer because she was a daydreamer. Her imagination would bloom and she would follow it to wherever it took her. And before long, she was staring off into the trees or into the sky, and her brother George would be like, "Maxine, come on, you have to time me. You have to do it. Mom was such a good timer. Why are you always daydreaming?" And Maxine would be like, okay, I got it. Yes, do it again. I've got it. I'll time it this time. We're good. And George would be like, ugh. Now there was another woman in the city. Everyone called her the Mad Woman. And she would wander the gardens and wander the streets, singing songs and whispering stories. And I'll tell you what, the Mad Woman showed up whenever Maxine was trying to time her brother. It seemed like at the most important moment, the Mad Woman would always show up. And Maxine would hear her beautiful songs, and she would look over at the Mad Woman singing and feeding the birds. And these songs felt so familiar to Maxine. She wondered, is the Mad Woman coming inside my dreams? How does she know? How does she know what my imagination sounds like? And when Maxine was distracted by the Mad Woman, her brother would say, "Ugh, are you looking at that Mad Woman again? Ignore her, she's crazy." Oh, don't want to drop that. Ignore her, she's crazy. Come on, focus. And Maxine would be like, right. So on this particular day where our story begins, George was about to graduate into full doerhood. And that night there would be a large banquet, tons of food, a big celebration for George's graduation into full doerhood. So Maxine and George and her parents, they got dressed in their finest clothes and they headed down to the banquet hall. And they went into the banquet hall and there were tables laid with tons of beautiful food. And of course, the king was at the back sitting at a table that was much higher up, and as usual, he was flanked by his armed guards. And on a podium was a big square hat with a big circular clock, and this hat would be placed on George's head to acknowledge that he had graduated into full doerhood. So Maxine and her family sat down to eat, and they were talking with everyone, and then Maxine heard something. It was the song of the Mad Woman, drifting through the window. And Maxine didn't really like fancy parties. She didn't really like talking to all those adults, and her dress was really itchy, and she was really uncomfortable. So she crept outside the doors of the banquet hall and went around the banquet hall and saw the Mad Woman sitting in the rose garden next to the banquet hall on a bench. And the Mad Woman looked at Maxine and said, motioned like this. So Maxine went and sat down next to the Mad Woman and looked at her. And the Mad Woman continued to sing her beautiful song. And then the Mad Woman reached out and she plucked a rose hip from one of the rose bushes. And she held it out. And she began to peel back the peachy, golden skin. And when she did, inside, a bundle of glowing seeds were revealed, glowing like fireflies. And the Mad Woman plucked out a seed and looked at Maxine and went. And Maxine put out her hand, and the Mad Woman put the seed into Maxine's hand. And Maxine looked at it, and looked at the Mad Woman again, and the Mad Woman said, "Eat it. Go ahead. Eat it." And Maxine ate it. She ate the seed, and she swallowed it. And then it was as if she was rushing through a dark tunnel, and everything was whirling around her. And when she opened her eyes, she was in a soft, liquidy place with darkness all around, and all she could hear was ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Dreaded spoon. And she looked to her left and saw to her left a tiny baby rabbit. And she looked to her right and saw to her right a tiny baby rabbit. And she looked down at her own body and saw that her own body was the body of a tiny baby rabbit. She was in the womb of a mother rabbit. And then all of a sudden the womb began to pulse and swell and move and whoosh. And then Maxine was whooshed out and she came out into the rabbit den and was reborn that night as a rabbit. She opened her eyes and saw the den, the walls of the den all around her, her little baby rabbit brothers and sisters. And then she did just like her rabbit brothers and sisters did. She began to nurse at the mother rabbit. She was a rabbit now. She was reborn a rabbit. So she spent a few weeks in the den, or a few months, I'm not sure how long, and then it was time for the baby rabbits to emerge out of the den. And so they did, and they came out. Maxine blinked her eyes and saw the light of day. And she looked all around, and then she turned behind her, and she saw great walls stretching for as far as she could see. And she looked to her right and she saw the factories with the great plumes of smoke rising. And she said, oh my goodness, I've been reborn outside of the city. I've never been outside the city walls before. Oh my goodness. And the mother rabbit, you know, Maxine did her best to be the best rabbit she could, but her mother rabbit was always like, this little rabbit doesn't know a clover from a thistle. This is a strange little rabbit. Eat like your brothers and sisters eat. Play like your brothers and sisters play. And Maxine would do her best. And her mother said, I'm going to call you Clover, just to help you remember what it is you're supposed to be nibbling. So that became Maxine's rabbit name, Clover. But Maxine, because the factories and the maker's village was nearby her den, and she began to get really curious about what was going on over there in the maker's village. So she would sneak away from her brothers and sisters, and one day she went and she was looking and she was seeing children playing, maker children playing, and some people were tending the garden and they were playing games. And she said out loud to herself, she said, I can't believe I never met these people. They lived just outside the wall the whole time. And then one of the maker girls turned and looked at her and said, what? Did someone say something? And Maxine said, well, I said something, but you can't hear me. And the little girl said, well, yes, I can. That's why I asked you if you said something. Wait, you can hear me? And Maxine was like, well, I just answered your question, so I guess I can hear you. Wait, you can understand me? I'm a rabbit. And the little girl was like, you can understand me? I'm a human. And the little girl was like, come on. And she motioned, and she and Maxine went and stood behind a giant oak tree. And the little girl said, well, if we're going to talk to each other, then we should be properly introduced. My name's Cora. And Maxine said, my name's Maxine, but everyone calls me Clover. And Cora was like, well, what do you want to be called? And she was like, Maxine. Okay, nice to meet you, Maxine. You know, my grandmother tells me stories about a time when our people were able to talk to rabbits. And I always thought that they were just stories, and I never thought that they were true, but now I think that they must be true because I'm talking to you, and you're a rabbit. Oh my goodness. Here's what you should do. Every morning, come meet me behind this big oak tree, and I'll show you everything that my people do. I can take you to school with me. You can learn what we learn. I can show you our beehives and our gardens, and then maybe you can come to one of our woodland parties where we sneak off into the forest really, really late at night and play music and dance. You can come to all of it. And Maxine was like, oh, okay, yes. Are you my friend? And Cora said, well, of course I'm your friend. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. So that's how it went. Maxine would come and meet Cora behind the oak tree, and then she would go to school with Cora really, really early in the morning because the maker people, they would have school before they had to go to the factory, so they got up really early. And the things they learned were unlike anything Maxine had ever learned before. They learned how to play music, how to sing together to make beautiful harmonies. They learned this very strange type of mathematics that Maxine had never even heard of before. They learned how to make medicine out of plants and tend to their gardens. They learned all sorts of things. Maxine loved going to school with Cora. So she would go to school with Cora, and then she would play with Cora, and one night, the night that Maxine had been waiting for finally came. Cora, at the end of the afternoon, she said, sneak back out here. We're going to have a woodland party. Sneak out of your warren and come meet me here right after the sun sets. So Maxine did. And she went with the Maker Village deep into the forest, and they played music and they danced, and it was the most beautiful music and the most beautiful dancing that Maxine had ever seen in her life. And that night when she crept back into her den, she slept more soundly than she had ever slept since she became a rabbit. So one night when she was in her den and all the rabbits were settled down, getting ready to go to sleep, they started to hear shouting, wailing, pounding, and the rabbits emerged from their den and they looked and they saw that the whole Maker Village, all of the Maker people, had gathered around outside the walls of the city. And outside the city gates, a long, long line of armed guards. And the Maker people were shouting. They were shouting about how they had to work too much, how they were paid too little, how they had to breathe in smoke all day. I'll pick it up later. I'm gonna need it later, don't worry. How they had to breathe smoke all day, how enough was enough, how they wouldn't do it anymore. They chanted and they chanted and they shouted over and over. And then the guards enclosed around them in a big circle. And the shouting got louder. And the guards enclosed more tightly. And then a shot was fired. And everyone went silent. And Maxine saw as all the Maker people went and gathered around the body of a young man who had been shot by the guards. And they wept and they wailed all night long. Maxine and the rabbits went back down into their den, and Maxine said, well, we have to do something. The guards, they killed one of the Maker boys. We have to do something. And Maxine's rabbit mother was like, it's best for us to mind our own business. That's what's safe, and that's what we're gonna do. Now come on and go to sleep. This will all blow over. It's best for us rabbits to mind our own business. So the next morning, Maxine woke up and she went to behind the oak tree, and she really hoped that Cora would be there. And Cora was later than normal. And Cora walked to the oak tree, and her shoulders were hanging low. And she came to Maxine. And Maxine looked at Cora's face, and there were tears streaming down her cheeks. And Maxine said, Philip, they killed Philip. He was my brother's friend, and now he's gone. And Maxine began to weep, or Cora began to weep, and Maxine also began to feel wet rabbit tears course down her cheeks. And Maxine looked at Cora and she said, you know how I told you about those stories that my grandmother told me? Well, also in those stories, they used to tell us that it was possible for the people and the rabbits to come together to call on the big ones in times of need. And if I can talk to you, then that shows us that the stories are true, so maybe we really can call on the big ones. Maybe we really can. Maxine, you have to go and talk to the rabbits. You have to tell them about the stories. You have to tell them that the stories are true. And you have to be ready to hear our call. You have to be ready when we call on you. And Maxine said, okay, I'll do it. So she went back into her den, and everyone was settling down to go to sleep, and it had gotten very quiet. And Maxine said, I have something I would like to say. And everyone was like, what? We're just going to sleep. Clover, what is it? And she was like, the old stories are true. The humans can still talk to rabbits, and the rabbits can still talk to humans, and it's still possible for us to come together to call on the big ones, and we have to do it because the Maker people are in trouble. We just have to. And Clover's mother was like, Clover, those are just stories. Go to bed. Come on. You remember what I told you. We just need to mind our own business. But then someone heard another sound coming from way deep in the warren. They heard a voice, and the voice said, the strange little rabbit is right. The strange little rabbit is right. And everyone looked and they were like, Great-grandmother Rabbit? You haven't spoken in years. The more you know, the less there is to say. But it's important for me to speak now. We must ready ourselves for when the Makers call. We must ready ourselves to call on the big ones. The time has come, and the stories, they're true. And no one ever argued with Great-grandmother Rabbit. So all the rabbits went to bed that night, and they prepared themselves for whatever it was to come. So the next morning, the rabbits awoke as the sun rose, and they heard a great thumping that went on and on and on. A great and tremendous thumping. And the rabbits came out of their den, and they saw that all the Maker people had gathered together, and they were all thumping. They were thumping with all of their heart, and then the rabbits, they started to thump too, and before long the rabbits with their big feet, everyone was thumping. Thump, 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 thump. And then another sound came, the crashing and the snapping and the big footsteps. And out of the forest emerged 3 big ones. They had big, beautiful feet, big, glittering eyes. They wore aprons, and they carried big spoons. And when they opened their mouths, you could see the whole galaxy stretching back into their throats, and starlight would pour out of their mouths. And the big ones began to stomp and march toward the walled city. And as they did, they laughed their big, beautiful, terrible laughter. And they came to the walls of the big city, and the guards came out of the gate and made a line around the walls, and they had their weapons, and they aimed and they shot at the big ones, and the big ones just took their spoons and whacked their bullets right out of the air. Thwack, thwack, thwack. And they went right up to the guards, and they took their guns and bent them right in half. What are you gonna do now? And then they reached down and they picked up the guards one by one and ate them. And they knocked down the walls of the city, smashed everything, and they marched right up to the king's castle. And the king was like, "You stop right there, guards!" And the guards came out and started shooting again, and thwack, thwack, thwack. The bullets were like little, I don't know, badminton birdies, just nothing. And the king was like, "You stop right there. I have a direct connection to the master of time." And the big ones just went, "Oh boy, listen to this one." And they reached down and they picked up the king and they ate him too. And now that the king was gone and the guards were gone, the maker people began to play music and dance and celebrate, and the rabbits joined in with them, and the rabbits and the people of the maker village were dancing and celebrating together. But the time perfecters, they all just stood there completely dumbfounded with their mouths hanging open. Well, what do we do? If we don't have the king to tell us the best way to perfect time, then we can't lay the stone that makes the path that leads to the realm where there's no more pain and no more loss and no more time at all. What do we do? What do we do? And Maxine's brother George said, "We will continue on this good work even without our king. We have all the notes from all the years past, and we'll just continue to do what we've always done before. We will keep the noble work of time perfecting going, no matter what these big ones say, no matter that our walls are down, no matter that our king is gone. Who's with me?" And a lot of the men were like, "I'm with you," and they all gathered around George. And then Belda, who was one of the big ones, came up to George and she said, "Ooh, what if there is no place like that, where there's no pain, no loss, no time? What if when your king goes to sleep at night, he dreams about money and his mommy? Ooh, what about that?" And George was like, "Well. And then Velda, who was another one of the big ones, was like, Now, Belda, there is a place. It's not exactly like that place, but you know there is a place." And then Melda, the other one, was like, "Well, there is a place, but you don't get there in a straight line, and it's definitely not up." And then Velda was like, "Well, sometimes it's up, but sometimes it's in, and sometimes it's definitely down." And Velda was like, "Well, anyway, okay, young man, well, if you're so set on continuing to time everything you do, I'd like to know what you time yourself with." And he pulled out his watch and held it proudly and said, "I time myself with this, the most accurate watch in all the world." And Belda said, "Oh, is that watch still working?" And he looked down at it, and the hands on the clock started to spin really fast. And he looked up at Belda and he was like, What? And she was like, "Oh no, take a look at it again. I'm sure it's fine now." And then he looked back down at his watch again, and the watch had become a giant red strawberry. And then he looked back up at Belda with his mouth hanging open, and Belda said, "Well, are you gonna eat it?" "No?" "Okay." And she ate it. Nothing like a ripe red strawberry. Ooh! Then everyone else started to take out their watches, and their watches became frogs that leapt out of their hands, became honey that dripped through their fingers, became the teeth of beavers. No one's watch worked anymore. No one's watch even existed anymore. So now, no one could keep time anymore. And you see, the makers, they already knew how to live together. They knew how to cook together. They knew how to learn together. They knew how to dance together. So they were doing just fine. But the time perfecters, they'd spent their whole lives perfecting time. They just didn't know what to do with themselves. And Belda looked down at George and she said, Well, if you need something to do, you can come help me make the stew. Come on, come on. And before he knew it, George was chopping up carrots and potatoes and throwing them into a giant pot. And that's how it went. The big ones would make a big stew every night. They'd tell a story every night. At first, everyone stood really far back when they told stories. But then, of course, the children were the first to get closer. And then the children actually started to sit on the lap of the big ones. And then the adults came in and started listening to stories. And time passed, but no one knew how much. Maybe it was days, weeks, months, who knows? But one lazy afternoon, Belda and Melda and Velda, they were sitting lounging in the sun, and they looked around, and they saw that some people were working in the garden, some people were chopping vegetables for the stew, but a lot of people were laying in the grass, gazing up at the sky, daydreaming. And Belda looked at her sisters and said, well, I think it might be time for us to head on home. And Velda and Melda said, well, you know, we were thinking that too. So we'll do it tonight then. Belda said, yep, we'll do it tonight. So the sun set and night fell, and Belda and Velda and Melda came out into the center of the walled city. And they began to stamp their feet and thwack their spoons against their big hands. And they began to sing. Oh, little children, all of you are children, all of you are here by no mistake. All your nightmares, oh, little children, they will turn to honey when you wake. Bowls of rain, bowls of honey, bowls of rain. Drink and then be full. Now a new heart grows inside you. Oh, little children, all of you are children. All of you are here by no mistake. And at the end of their song, everyone looked into the sky, and petals began to fall from the sky, and rain began to fall, and fireflies darted in and out of the petals in the rain. And Belda and Melda and Velda looked at everyone who had gathered. Even the makers had gathered round. And they said, well, you didn't think we'd just take your king and his guards home with us in our bellies. No. It's time for them to come home too. And so they reached back into their mouths, down their throats, down into their stomachs, and they began to pull out the guards, one by one. And as they pulled them out of their mouths, they were little tiny babies. And each one they pulled out, little tiny baby after little tiny baby, and set them on the ground. And then the babies began to cry. And as the people heard their cries, they rushed to the babies and picked them up and began to hold them close. And then Maxine looked around and looked down, and she saw that her legs had become human legs again. Her feet had become human feet again. And she looked up and she looked for her family, and she ran to her mother and she said, Mother! And her mother said, Maxine! And they embraced, and they also wept. And then the big ones turned to leave. And all there was the rain and the sound of babies crying and the smell of flowers in the air.